Labdien visiem, kas ir klāt, un labdien tiem skatītājiem, kas ir pieslēgušies tagad. Un es ceru, gribu uzdot jautājumus, vai tiem, kas skatīsies vēlāk, kad visi jautājumi jau būs uzdoti. Šodien mēs esam Žaņa Lipkas memoriālā, un ar mums ir Tel Avivas profesors Urijas Šavits, kurš ir eksperts gan islāma vēstures jautājumos, gan par holokausta vēsturē, un viņš ir no Tel Avivas universitātes. Kā jūs redzat, lekcijas nosaukums ir Izraēlas kritika, vai tas ir antisemītisms, un kur tad ir tā robeža starp kritiku pret Izraēlas politiku, vai arī principā par kādas ir izrēliešu izvēles. Par to mēs arī aicinām jums uzdot jautājumus. Un tagad es pāriešu uz angļu valodu, jo lekcija ir angļu valodā. Jautājums jūs varat sūtīt gan angliski, gan latviski. Mēs viņus iztulkosim un uzdosim. Paldies jums visiem. Okay, that was introduction. You understood most of it? Okay, great. Great. Okay, so I have to present our speaker, who is Urijas Šavit, and he was born in Tel Aviv, so you must be very cold here now. And after completing military service, he joined the daily newspaper Haaretz, and he worked in an international affair analyst and editor. He has received his PhD degree in Islamic history from Tel Aviv University, and he's a senior lecturer now in Arabic and Islamic studies there. So Šavit specializes in the study of Islamic law and politics, and has published several books on these subjects with Israeli and English language publishers. So he's also author of Israel's best-selling Guide for University Students. So you are a professor, you've been teaching a lot and traveling the world. You understand, so we have, because there is a war between Israel and Hamas, we'll have some tough questions also for you. But floor is now yours. Give us an introduction about the subject. And hopefully everyone who is listening now or later will ask you questions, because it's great to have expert here. Thank you to Israeli embassy that it was possible to bring you here, and everyone else who is here present. I hope you'll have also questions for our speaker today. So floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Actually, because we're not a very big group, may I sort of inquire where people are from, just that I know also which jokes, for example, not to tell? Oh, yes, Spain. Please. Spain?
Austria?
Austria?
US.
US? And?
Me?
Yeah?
Oh, I'm from Latvia.
From Latvia?
Czech Republic.
Czech Republic? Germany? Greece?
Sweden.
Sweden? Okay, that's quite a... And? China, so that's quite the United Nations. I've actually been to all of these countries, I have to say. So I'll get straight to the point, which is where do we draw the line between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism? And it is very important to draw the line. I'll say the obvious, which is that just like any other country, criticism directed at Israel is absolutely legitimate and acceptable, and I think we are always better off in a situation where people are just free to speak their minds, rather than be afraid that one or another thing that they say will be labeled as illegitimate. And that's basically what we're doing when we're saying your statement is anti-Semitism. What we're doing is delegitimizing it, saying it's unacceptable discourse. So we have to be very careful about that. In a way, one of the biggest achievements, I would say, of the Western world and of humanity at large, ironically, is that today no one would like to be identified as an anti-Semite. I think we had a great example of that we are having actually a great example of that in the war in Ukraine, because here you had the Russian regime, a fascist regime, invading another country, challenging international law and the liberal world order, and doing it in the name of denazification. that is doing it in the name of fighting anti-Semitism. So I think it all comes down in the end to the following question. What makes criticism of Israel anti-Semitic discourse? Where is the line drawn? And I think what we are witnessing at the moment is people across Europe and across the world actually, who find that it is totally and absolutely legitimate to march on streets and shout from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. We are seeing that. And where do we draw the line? Say, by doing that, they're anti-Semites, because those chants are directed against a state, not against a people, hypothetically. So when they chant, Palestine will be freed from the river to the sea, why do we identify that as anti-Semitism? I think the answer is actually quite simple. I can't make it complicated, but I think it's actually quite simple, and it's simple because of the following reason. When you chant, Palestine will be freed from the river to the sea, you are calling for the elimination of a state. There is a state that exists, the State of Israel. It was established in 1948, May 14th, 1948, as a result of a United Nations General Assembly resolution that was passed on November 29th, 1947. That state exists. When you call for its elimination, that it will not exist anymore, you owe the world an answer. Why do you do just that? Why do you call for the elimination of the State of Israel and not for the elimination of other entities? So, the common answer I think you'll hear from people is the following: that the State of Israel is illegitimate for one of two reasons. Number one, you'll hear it's illegitimate because it is based on a colonial enterprise. The Zionists are colonialists. They have a state, maybe it was recognized at some point in history when colonialism was considered acceptable, but that their state is being based on colonialism renders it illegitimate, and it should be destroyed because colonialism is wrong. And then the other answer you'll get, which is not, the two are not mutually exclusive, is that it is a state based on inherent injustice committed by one people against another. The problem, I think, any person who's well versed in history will have with that argument is that you are, when you're asking the person who said that, you're asking, what is so uniquely wrong with so-called Zionist colonialism? Why is it that you are chanting and marching against what you interpret as Zionist colonialism, and you are totally fine with American colonialism, Canadian colonialism, Argentinian colonialism, Saudi colonialism, and so forth? These are all states based historically 200 years ago, 300 years ago, on someone taking over someone else's land. What's the difference? If there is a difference, then the difference lies in favor of Israel and the circumstances of its establishment. Because unlike other colonial movements. Again, not from the river to the sea, from Australia to Canada. Unlike other colonial movements, the Zionists purchased lands with money. Not because they were such righteous people, but because they had no choice. That was the only way to advance Zionism at the time, to purchase lands. Almost all the lands where the state of Israel existed when it was established, all the lands that were Israeli based on the partition plan, all those lands were bought with money. They were not taken over forcefully. I'm not even mentioning the fact that there was a continued Zionist, or not Zionist, but Jewish existence in that land for hundreds of years. And the Jews were always between 5 to 10% of the land in its historical sense. They ended up getting, in the partition plan, they ended up getting those 5%. So I'm not even entering that argument. Just saying, if you wanna compare one colonial movement to the other, then if you insist that Zionism is a colonialist movement, is a colonial movement, then it is a better one than some in history. But you'll hear the following counter argument from the likes of Roger Waters. You'll hear, and by the way, this is also an argument I think we can be sympathetic to, which is, in life, you have to choose your wars. You cannot fight everything. You cannot correct every evil. So some of those people will say, we're not saying other things are fine. We're not happy with other things, but we choose to direct our attention to the state of Israel, to that specific injustice. Yes, we know the Russians are doing horrible things. We know Iran is doing horrible things. We know North Korea is doing horrible things. But we choose to direct our attention to this. That's our choice. One person is dedicating his or her life to vegetarianism, one to feminism, one to environmentalism. You know, people have different priorities. That's our priority. I'm fine with that as well. But nevertheless, I will insist, in such circumstance, I will insist on that person just answering in the hypothetical the following question. Are you fine with Boston? Are you okay with it ideologically? Are you fine with Toronto? I'm not asking you to direct your attention to the correction of that so-called evil. But I just want to know when it's Americans, when it's Canadians, not to mention when it's Brits. I just want an answer to that. Are you ideologically okay with the existence of the United States? If someone tells me, yes, I am, and they're not stupid, they will say, yes, they are, because they understand the implications of saying we are against all those countries. Someone will say, yes, I am. Then we need to really sort of ask in an uncompromising way. We need to demand an answer. Why is it that you are specifically ideologically against the creation of the state of Israel and its existence? Not why are you directing your attention to its existence? Why do you ideologically object to that type of what you identify as colonialism? Although, again, I have to say there are many arguments why it should not be considered colonialism at all. But if you do, then why is your attention directed just there? And the suspicion that maybe the answer just might be not an objection to colonialism, but an objection to the existence of the state of the Jews, of a Jewish state. Well, that suspicion, I think, all of a sudden becomes somewhat solidified. And if you object only to the existence of the state of Israel based on criteria which should have been applied to other states logically, then there isn't really another name for you other than an anti-Semite. So this is really where things stand. You're anti-Semite if your direction, your anger is directed just towards the state of Israel for things which historically other nations have done. There is, by the way, an interesting twist here, which is, and I always find this is the one question that leaves Islamists sort of speechless when I engage with them, which is, as all of you know, Muslims have not always been in Palestine, or what they call Palestine. They occupied the land in the 7th century. So when you ask the following question, an Islamist, you say you're against the state of Israel because it occupied a Muslim land. Some say, yes, finally, he understands what I'm talking about. So my understanding is that you are against occupations of other lands. Yes, obviously. So you're against the Muslim occupation of Palestine from the Christians in the 7th century. I didn't say that. But that's exactly what you're saying. But the problem of Hamas is really not with occupation. The problem of Hamas is with occupation which is not Muslim. And that is something which I think Europeans are not aware enough of. If you read the charter of Hamas, and I recommend that you do, I have to say I regret that so few Israelis have read it. You don't need to be fluent in Arabic to read it, because there are translations all over the web, including I think one that our foreign ministry took care of some years ago. If you read the charter of Hamas, what is it that Hamas wants? Well, they do not want a Palestinian state. They do not wish for a two-state solution. They wish for the elimination of the state of Israel and the creation of one Islamic state on that territory. What is their argument? What is the premise for that quest to eliminate the state of Israel? The argument is that this land used to be Muslim land. The Jews took it over from the Muslims. It was an endowment. It's waqf. It's a waqf land. It's a Muslim land. But if you follow through with that logic, what is the implication? If the fight is against any country that at some point in history was Muslim and then was taken over by non-Muslims, this does not apply just to the state of Israel. Let's think of additional examples. It applies, for example, to Spain. It used to be a Muslim land. It applies to Greece. It applies to Cyprus. It applies to Romania. It applies to Bulgaria. It applies to Hungary. It applies to Serbia. It applies to so many European lands. It doesn't apply to Latvia. At least that. Which means, if Hamas are allowed to succeed, well, do the math yourself. What would the implication be? So there is a civilizational element to this war. That is, it is a war of people who speak in the name of Islam. I'm not saying they represent Islam, but they speak in the name of Islam. And the crusade is against the Western world as a Western world. And we have to be conscious about the implications of this war ending with Hamas prevailing. We have to understand what the implication would be. What would it be? I think it would be horrifying. I think it would be horrifying, and let me tell you why. There was a diplomatic process going on between Israel and the Palestinians, between Israel and the PLO, the organization that the international community accepted, not with Israel consenting to that acceptance, but the organization that the international community, the United Nations also, accepted as the one legitimate representative of the Palestinians. There was a diplomatic process going on since 1993 and in fact before. It is known as the Oslo process because it was negotiated secretly on the outskirts of Oslo for some time, but the official legal name is the Declaration of Principles. That is what Israel and the Palestinians signed on September 13th, 1993. That process has never been given a chance to succeed. Never been given a chance. Now, I know many Israelis believe that the PLO was never serious and never really committed. And the truth is, when you read the declarations of Yasser Arafat at the time and other PLO representatives, they were always ambiguous. And a lot of Palestinians argue that Israel was never sincere. And they have credible arguments to substantiate that claim. But the fact is, you had two sides who officially committed to a peaceful resolution and officially committed to making sacrifices, to making compromises. Rhetorically, and they demonstrated that on the ground. So we have that reality. And we also have the reality that we know that in the end, even if this fighting will go on for 200 years, in the end there isn't really a solution other than dividing the land between those two peoples. Maybe it will take 20 years, maybe 200 years, but there isn't another solution. And you had in that process, from day one, a disruptor called Hamas. An organization that declared it does not accept the Oslo process. It considers it treason against the Palestinian people and treason against Islam, and did everything in its power to end it. Not just to injure it, but to force it to end. October 7 was one day with 1,200 people murdered and tortured and raped. But there was a decade between 1994 to 2003 in which the same number of Israelis, civilians, and Israeli civilians I mean also Arab Israeli civilians, were killed in bus attacks and attacks on cafes and on clubs by the same organization. Now, it took 10 years, but the methods were similar and the intention was similar. So when I hear representatives of European Union countries say what we want, what we desire is for Israel to remain safe, for Israeli security to re-emerge on the one hand, and for the war to end, for a ceasefire to be implemented, and for the peace process to be resumed, say each and every one of those things is correct, but you can't have them all together at once. If you want Israel to be safe again, you have to eradicate Hamas. And if you want the peace process to ever be resumed, you have to give it for once a chance to move forward without that organization intimidating Palestinians and murdering Israelis. I'm not saying it will be a success if you give it that opportunity, but it was never given the chance once. You know, and so many historians today and political scientists argue even if it had been given the chance, it would have failed. And I'm not a fortune teller, especially not a retrospective one. I don't know. I'm saying it wasn't given the chance. Don't those two peoples deserve the chance to once try and renegotiate without murderous Islamists there? As a final word, you know, people now argue, are Hamas Nazis, are they not Nazis? Read the Charter of Hamas again. It is a blatantly anti-Semitic document. in the sense that it uses almost every anti-Semitic trope that exists in the world, including the protocols of the Elders of Zion, as the document that tells you the truth about the Jews. But unlike Nazism, Hamas ideology is not fundamentally based upon anti-Semitism. It's a component that was added to the Islamist mindset, to the Islamist way of thinking during the 20th century. It is not the foundation of Islamism, but today it became an inherent part of it. And the trouble with anti-Semitism, as with conspiracy theories in general, is that they blind you. It's like a sickness. They make it impossible for you to see reality for what it is, to see Jews for who they are, to see the state of Israel for what it is, for better and for worse. So I think one lesson if there is one lesson, there are many lessons, but if there is one lesson with regards to anti-Semitism that we should learn from October 7th, is that one of the requirements by the international community, not just to the Palestinians, one of the demands, not just to the Palestinians, but to the Arab world at large, and in fact to the world at large, would be to purify educational systems, and I use the word purify intentionally, to purify them from anti-Semitic discourses. Because you will never have lasting peace. You will never even have a chance for a prospect for lasting peace between Israel and its Arab neighbors as long as anti-Semitism is such an inherent element of the way young people are brought up. I'll tell you just in conclusion a very short anecdote that one day I was reading a seminar paper that was submitted in one of my classes about two Arab intellectuals. And it is important for the context of this anecdote that it was submitted by an Arab student, but one who serves in the IDF. Someone who's anything but anti-Israeli or anti-Zionist. And I was reading it, and I saw every second reference, more or less, directed me to the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is kind of strange. And at first I thought, and don't tell me you never thought of that when you were in school, maybe it's someone testing whether I'm actually reading papers in Arabic. And I felt very uncomfortable about the entire situation, so I asked to meet with the student. And he told me, I had no idea what the protocols of the Elders of Zion is. I never heard about it. The reason why it's in my references is that for me, when I write papers, it is much easier to read in Arabic. So I went to a university library in the West Bank to locate books for my paper on that topic. And that's simply the book that I found. There is an alternative world out there where the protocols of the Elders of Zion are on the bookshelf the same way when we were kids we had Encyclopedia Britannica. There is an alternative world where the protocols of the Elders of Zion are a historical document. And that alternative world needs to change if we are seriously thinking about changing Middle Eastern politics and Middle Eastern societies. So maybe I'll end here, so we have time for discussion and questions. Would that be a good point to conclude?
Great point.
Thank you.
Okay, I really hope some of you have questions, and I know that it's usually I'll start, and then hopefully there'll be more. My question is, you mentioned the protocols of Elders of Zion. This is very widely used, not even a document, text that is typically used for anti-Semitic attacks. So, what do you think? Why is it used now in this Hamas Israeli narrative? Where all these things suddenly come from? Because what's a bit disturbing is it's not only about the critique of Israeli policies with Palestinians, with territories, with settlers, but suddenly this plan that this is what is happening because Jews are taking over the world, pretty much.
Yeah. So let's take a step back. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion are a conspiracy theory. And in Europe, you will not find them on bookshelves. In the Arab world, you would. By the way, in the Arab world, you will also very easily find a book called Kifahi.
In Latvia, you can pretty easily find it.
Well, then that's something you need to self-reflect about. But I don't think you will find the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in Germany or in Austria or in France unless you really like to have a prison time, a prison term. So it is a question, why is it easy to find it in Latvia? But in the Arab world, you will find the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and you will very easily find a book that Arabs know by the name Kifahi, and Germans know by the name Mein Kampf. And that is disturbing, that you can so easily find. What is this book? It's a conspiracy theory. A Russian one, by the way. Intended at the time to distract attention to something else. Now, what is a conspiracy theory? A conspiracy theory is an alternative narrative about reality. We all know that a man landed on the moon. When was it? Never happened. What are you saying? Never happened. It was all filmed in a Hollywood studio. But bear in mind, at the time it happened, or did not happen, 10% of Americans, and according to some surveys even more, thought it never happened. Now, that it never happened is an alternative narrative about reality. Why do we come up with alternative narratives about reality? There was never COVID, a man did not land on the moon, Elvis is still singing in some clubs in Alabama, and the Jews rule the world. Why do we do that? Well, for two main reasons. One, because we really don't like reality. We don't like it. We don't like reality for what it is. So we come up with an alternative story. A reality that is more to our liking, that makes sense about some things we're not happy about, some things we're not happy with. And the other reason is because we are deeply distrustful of our government, of our institutions. We don't trust them. They say things, but we have no faith in them. So when will people be more attentive to conspiracy theories, such as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion? When they're very unhappy with reality, or when they have strong distrust of governments. I don't think the protocols are stronger at the moment than they were, let's say, 2 months ago because of what happened on October 7th. But I do think we are living in a day and age where a lot of people are unhappy. We see it across Western democracies. A lot of people are deeply dissatisfied with the realities of their societies, and a lot of people have no trust in their governments and in establishments. We saw that during COVID times. A lot of people are distrustful, and then they look for those alternative narratives. The advantage, so-called advantage, of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion as such an alternative narrative is twofold. First, it wasn't invented yesterday. It wasn't fabricated yesterday. And there is this funny thing. If you tell a lie that's 100 years old, people tend to trust it much more than if you tell a new lie. So that is, if you tell a lie that people were deceived to think is truth for 100 years, somehow just the duration makes it seem more reliable. And the other, I would say, advantage of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion as an alternative narrative, a conspiracy theory, is that it provides a comprehensive explanation. If you accept it, then everything makes sense. Now, one of the most ridiculous texts I've ever read in Arabic was by a Saudi author, I think from 1995, and that makes a difference, and who explained in great length how, listen carefully, the World Cup, the Mondial, was invented by the Zionists to mess up with the minds of young Muslims, and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion are proof and demonstration that this is in fact what happened. Now you laugh, but this was a serious text, and it's one of great many texts that more or less say the same things. Whichever it is, whichever happens in the Arab world we are not happy with, it's the Jews' fault. And the way we can validate this assertion or this accusation is by pointing to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. That's the ultimate source. You'd be surprised what clever people will come up with these arguments. That if you read the Protocols, you know that the Jews are responsible for this and for that.
Okay, so it's nice that you're ruling the world, turns out, but
My being here is, of course, proof. That's the problem with conspiracy theories. Whatever you say against them, your presence and statements are proof that you're part of the conspiracy. Therefore, you shouldn't be trusted.
yes, but I would like to kind of reflect that you are a professor also of Islam studies and you know Arabic. So one of the narratives now, what is happening is for Jewish people in Israel, and in many cases people don't know that there are different ethnicities living in Israel, to leave Israel for Palestinians or for Arabs, stop the occupation, and to return to your homeland. And then there's the different versions. It's never Arab lands, because most of the people kind of don't know that Jews came also from Morocco and Iran and Iraq and Yemen and Ethiopia, but to kick them out to America. Welcome to Americans present here, or to Poland, or we've never heard Latvia, but still, it's probably also on the list. So, what would be your kind of answer, reflection, why it's done in this particular way? It's from one side, it's ridiculous because during Second World War, most of the countries didn't want to accept the Jews who were running, for their lives. But now at this point, suddenly it's like, let's move them out and let's give the Palestinians free land.
I think this goes back to what we discussed before. I mean, from the Arab point of view, and from the point of view of some in the so-called European left, I refuse to describe it as progressive left, because I don't think it is. The Zionist state is the colonial enterprise, and as such it is illegitimate. But you are very right in asking, I mean, why? What is inferred there? What is the suggestion? And how ridiculous this is. How was Saudi Arabia? How did it come into being? The current Saudi kingdom is the third Saudi kingdom. And it was founded based on the takeover of lands in the Hijaz and in Najd, and basically in the entire Arabian Peninsula, by a tribe, the Sauds, that had two kingdoms before, the first Saudi kingdom and then the second Saudi kingdom. Both were destroyed. They found shelter where? In Kuwait. And then they launched the third bid. And finally, after 30 years of fighting, managed to establish the third Saudi kingdom. You'll ask Arabs, is that a legitimate thing that happened? They'll say, most of them I think will say yes. There is, by the way, a Hijazi opposition movement in London. They'll say yes, they took over the land. The United Nations recognized that taking over. Actually, it's the League of Nations back then, but then the United Nations accepted Saudi Arabia as a legitimate member. That's it. That's the end of the story. Everything I've just described is very similar to the events in mandatory Palestine. There was a first Jewish kingdom, there was a second Jewish kingdom. If you will, the state of Israel is the third Jewish kingdom. It was accepted by the United Nations. The terms of the mandate were set by the League of Nations in 1922. You cannot argue that the state of Israel is illegitimate and that the Israeli Jews need to go back to some place from where they came, and not argue that Saudi Arabia overlaps with this example. Because the equivalence here is remarkable. But look, it's even more simple than that. Either we accept that there is an organization called the United Nations, and there is a principle of the sovereignty of states that are UN members, or you don't accept that. It's very risky to think you could make one distinction, and it will hold as one distinction. When war broke out in Ukraine, which is a diplomatic saying, when fascist Russia invaded Ukraine, I wrote several articles almost a day after, which I said, Jews everywhere in the world and the state of Israel should recognize Russia as a danger, not just for the sake of humanity, and not just because of the brutality and the aggression, which was unprovoked, but because this goes to the heart of the principle of international law. If one state that believes, as it did at the time, that it is stronger than other states, has the right to just occupy it, make some kind of Anschluss to that state, then we are back in 1939. And that is why Russia should not be allowed to succeed. And that is why I thought at the time, the state of Israel and Jewish organizations, based on the lessons of history, should be vehement about opposing the Russian aggression. People all around the Middle East, and I think Arab leaders understand that perfectly well, should realize if the sovereignty of Israel within its internationally recognized borders, these are the 1949 borders, if it is not recognized, if it is allowed to be challenged, which is what Hamas did on October 7th, then next in line you'd have Saudi Arabia, you'd have Jordan, you'd have Iraq. It will never end. There'll be anarchy now for ages. And that's, I think, is the best answer to what you asked.
Okay, do we have more questions? Or I'm bombing you with another one. And it's about Israelis being very critical towards the government. They also, some of them, especially left-wing, use that you have to, like, Israel should stop occupation of the West Bank, to pull out settlers from the territories. They're critical of the prime minister, all kinds of things, because Israel is a democratic country. You have variety of opinions. Mm-hmm. But how comes, and I don't think so, like unless we're talking about very radical people, they don't think that their fellow Israelis are anti-Semitic or something like that. But why it's like also from Israeli side, whenever people criticize Israel or its policies from outside, one of the first answers very often is, no, it's anti-Semitic, they're criticizing us just because we are Jews. So what would be your answer to that?
That you're an anti-Semite for asking me this.
Wonderful,
but still
answer. I would be happy to know the answer, yeah.
Look, I can't speak on behalf of Israelis or the Israeli government. I'm not representing the government. I can only speak for myself. I don't consider criticism of Israeli policies in the West Bank as anti-Semitism. Obviously, I don't consider criticism against the Israeli government as anti-Semitism. I was very clear at the beginning. If you deny the right of the state of Israel to exist, bear in mind, I'm not even immediately considering you as an anti-Semite. I want to know based on what you are denying that right. And given that the common answer is that Israel commits injustice and that Israel is a colonial enterprise, then to label you as an anti-Semite, all I want to know is whether you hold the same view also with regards to the United States, Canada, or countries that also commit injustices, such, let's say, as Russia or Iran. And if you're telling me, I decided as my life decision, the Roger Waters argument, I decided to focus on this, it's my right. I'm not saying the other things are okay, I'm decided. Then I would still like to ask you a very, very simple question. Do you nevertheless draw a distinction between those countries and Israel? Is Israel something that is unique? If for some reason only Israeli injustices should result in denial of the right of Israel to exist, if for some reason only so-called Zionist colonialism should result in the right of the state of Israel to exist, whereas you approve of other colonial enterprises, so-called colonial enterprises, then by definition, you're an anti-Semite. Or give me another explanation for that. Give me another explanation for Roger Waters. He is a human rights activist. He believes he is. Fine with that. But he has no problem with Russia. And he is against colonialism, but he has no problem with Australia. So I want to know, what is the reason that Israel is the only focus of his attention and anger, and that he doesn't like to see the continuation of its existence? Give me another explanation. Maybe there is one, but what would it be? Well, I will interpret this silence as that is the only possible answer. That he has a problem with Jews. Doesn't have a problem with the state of Israel. He has a problem with Jews and with Jewish sovereignty over any piece of it.
I wanted to ask a question. Is it on?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. We talk a lot about the rule-based order, the international community and the UN's role, and a lot of people are saying that it's constantly being challenged these days, both in the war in Israel, but also in the war in Ukraine. But then again, we also look at the UN, who's representing, to a large extent, this rule-based order, and we see the UN itself is unable to even utter the word Hamas. In General Assembly, the declaration that was adopted doesn't even mention Hamas. They don't mention there was a terror attack. UN Women Organization did not condemn only until recently and did not recognize that Israeli women were raped. UNICEF was solely concerned with Gazan children, but did not relate in its declarations and its addresses to Israeli children who were burnt alive and mutilated and kidnapped. So what do we think about this rule-based order?
Well, to say that the United Nations is a hypocritical organization, I think this would be like to say, the oldest text in the book. We know this to be the case. There is nothing new about that. I don't think the United Nations was different 20 years ago. It is what it is.
So, some more questions?
I think there is a hand there from Austria.
Yes. Well, 1, 2, 3, yeah.
Yeah, so as a Latvian, I know for a fact that there is alternative reality or history. For example, in Russians' books about history. And I can recognize in your lecture also that there is another world. If you read Arabic, there's a different explanations for world order and history. But my concern is with the European students and American students who kind of got a normal, pure education, and still they go on streets and shout these horrible things. And for example, personal experience, when I learned about Holocaust and about Hitler and whatever, there was never ever second thought or doubt that, give me full facts, or, it didn't happen in empty space, or I consider some kind of context or whatever. I recognize that this is pure evil. And truly we should always, as long as we live, to say that this was evil and it shouldn't ever happen. So as educator, me and you, we somehow failed our new generation where they got these ideas, how they can think that it's okay to cry for babies in Gaza. Yes, I'm also I'm always cry when some kid dies, but not to cry about Israeli babies. Like, what happened with the world? What kind of world do we live in?
Okay. Look, these are deep waters. I'll say two things. First, it's a case of one ignorance that leads to another. I think those young Europeans who go on marching on streets for Hamas, they know very little about Islamism. That's the truth. If they had read more, not about Islamism, but the Islamist texts, they would have understood, I think, that there is a certain gap between European liberalism and Islamism that cannot be bridged, and the two cannot ally. Now, I want you to know something. I spent the last 15 years of my life, actually a little more than 15, doing field studies in European mosques. And most of those were in radical European mosques. I'm not talking about all of these issues externally. Now, I'm going to surprise you. My experience was largely a very positive one. I was a welcome guest in most of these mosques. I see beauty in Islam, see beauty in a lot of Muslims. Some of them are my good friends. I don't want anyone to essentialize. You know, we say Islam, Muslims against Christians, Muslims against Jews. The issue is not with Islam as such. The issue is with a certain understanding of Islam, a certain application of Islam, a certain ideology that has Islam as its justification or as its premise. That is really where the issue lies. And I think if you read Islamist texts, you'll see that they really understand Islamists, really understand history and current affairs, and the two are related, really understand them dramatically different than you do. Dramatically different than you do, not as Christians, as Europeans. You understand the distinction. Dramatically different than the way you would understand it if you are a Muslim-born European educated in Western schools and not radicalized by a certain imam or by a certain internet website. Dramatically different. Really, the gap is such that cannot be bridged. The Islamist worldview is very much convinced that from the 18th century onward, the Muslim world is exposed to a very sophisticated Western plot, which they call in Arabic the ideological attack or the cultural attack, al-ghazw al-thaqafi or al-ghazw al-fikri, which was based on the following premise: we could never defeat Muslims militarily as long as they are faithful. Therefore, we must undermine their faith. And once we do that, we can take over Muslim lands without actually using force. The media, education, ideologies from feminism to Darwinism, ideologies and scientific theories, sports, fashion, movies, all of these are part of that grand plot. And the plot is so sophisticated, the way Islamists describe it, because it uses agents, people in the Muslim world that pretend to be Muslim, but are in fact Western agents. And Israel is right there. It is the ultimate manifestation of that plot. Because it's right inside the Middle East. What is the meaning of signing peace with Israel? What would be the implication of peace, a peace treaty? We'll have cultural relations. We'll have financial relations. What would be the implication of that? Self-destruction of our Muslim soul, of our Muslim spirit. When you believe in that, then peace as an option scares the hell out of you. Because it is much more than peace. It's an attack against Islam. And if we fail, if Westerners have failed, it's in not giving enough attention to reading Islamist texts and Islamist ideologies for what they are. And for branding anyone who does, today as an Orientalist, as an Islamophobic. No, I'm not Islamophobic. I would have to say I'm 180 degrees not Islamophobic in the sense that where I see danger, I identify it and I want people to reflect on it. And where I see beauty, I identify it as well. I think that's the approach we should apply. If I ask you, how many of you have read the Charter of Hamas, the 1988 Charter? None? But you know, I get this answer everywhere, also with Israeli audiences. Now, this is the one fundamental document. It takes 10 minutes to read. It's not Wittgenstein. No offense to anyone, but it's not a very complicated document. It takes 10, 15 minutes to read. And you don't need to be an expert in Islamic terminologies to understand the essence of it and how anti-Western it is, not anti-Israeli, anti-Western. But none of you are all very educated people. Obviously, you are engaged with the conflict or you would not have come today. None of you have read. Same with Israelis. It's their lives that depend on seeing the reality of what Hamas is for what it is. I can stand in front of a hall with 200 people. I would speculate sociologically, most of them center-left. None of them, not a single hand. How do you explain that? Please.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My question was about one of the things you said. You said I'm coming from a peace building background, just to preface that. So you said Hamas has been the disruptor in giving any of the peace talks a real chance. How do you see moving forward after everything that has happened, Israelis and Palestinians sitting together and actually succeeding in peace talks?
Look, I think something that looks one day impossible. We have been surprised many times in history of how things can transform rapidly. I'll give you one example. In the early 50s, if you had an Israeli passport, do you know what was said on page 3 of that passport? What was stated on page 3 of that passport? Stated, valid to all countries except for Germany. And something very different was built. I actually don't think there aren't many examples of good, healthy relations between two societies, youth exchanges, cultural exchanges, financial and political, as between Israel and Germany. And you can see it also, by the way, in opinion polls in Israel. It's really interesting to follow through the years how Germany became from the most unpopular country to one of the most popular. I've been following this for now 3 decades. It's remarkable. Why was that made possible? Well, the simple answer is, there are many reasons, but the foundation of it being made possible is that Germany was denazified. It's a different country. The Palestinian society needs to be, I don't want to use the term denazified, but de-Hamasicide is kind of complicated to say. But Palestinians need to be given the chance to live without that organization. And the international community needs to create that chance for them. It is not doing a very good job at that, I have to say, at the present time. It is doing a horrible job. Because they cannot liberate themselves. They proved unable to do so. They cannot liberate themselves. But unless they are freed from Hamas, it's not just that they will never have a chance at building a culture of peace. They will never have a chance at being prosperous. They will never have a chance to lead normal lives. That is the implication of the ideology of Hamas. So they need to be freed from Hamas. To those who say all Palestinians are pro-Hamas, I mean, we have surveys that indicate this is not entirely untrue. But one question, why did Hamas never bother to hold democratic elections in the Gaza Strip, since those elections that it won by a fair margin, but by the way, not by an absolute majority of the votes. They had, I think, 44%. If they're so confident that they're popular, why were there never elections again for a second time in the Gaza Strip? I think you had one.
My question is in the same sense as hers. How can you maybe de-Hamasify the Gaza Strip or de-Islamic to get away these Islamistic powers in the West Bank and also especially in the Gaza Strip? How can you do this practically after maybe killing or arresting most of the Hamas fighters?
Yes, by eradicating that regime. In the end, it's I wouldn't say it's simple, but in the end, what needs to be done is clear cut. There is a regime there in Gaza now, and you need to make sure that it doesn't exist anymore. I don't like the terminologies the Israeli government uses, which are very indecisive. You know, what I said, I think, is very plain. When this war ends, this regime must not exist anymore. We know what that means. If there is a government and it doesn't exist anymore, we know the implication. The implications, it's not the one that pays salaries, it's not the one that has monopoly over violence or has the ability to apply violence at all. It's not the one that's responsible for water supplies, it's not the one that detains people. It doesn't exist as a government. When this war ends, Gaza Strip must be freed from that government. Now, I'm often being told, also from day one the war began, but you know, Hamas is not just a government, it's also an idea. And you cannot kill an idea. You heard that one before, I see by your nodding. Well, the truth is, we know from history, you can kill ideas. You can kill ideas. And you can kill ideas in one of two ways, which are not mutually exclusive. One, let those ideas be actualized in reality for a while. If they fail, the idea is killed. This is pretty much what happened with communism. It was tried, wasn't a big success, so I was told. And it doesn't have many great enthusiastic followers today. The other way to kill an idea is to kill. To kill the people who lead the idea, to kill the students of the people who lead the idea, to kill the people who publish the idea, to kill the people who sell the idea. You just kill them. This is pretty much what was done in Nazi Germany. They were killed. And it worked. And the idea about killing an idea is not that there will not be somewhere a book in which the idea is presented or a website in which the idea is presented. We have Nazi websites today, and we have, I understand, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion sold for some reason in Latvia. We have that. But you don't have the idea as a viable political force. There is no risk, I think, that Nazism will take over a European country in any foreseeable future. You can reach that point with Hamas. The idea will still exist, just like the ideas of ISIS still exist. But it will not be a viable political force. It will not be a danger. This, I think, can be accomplished, but only if the international community comes to its senses. it should have been at the forefront of supporting a decisive Israeli war in Gaza. It should have encouraged Israel to eliminate Hamas, and then it should have pressed Israel, then it should press Israel to make bigger efforts in a diplomatic process. But it is not doing that. It is doing quite the opposite, I have to say. It is leading to a situation in which this war will end with Hamas still to some extent in power, and the idea still being valid, and Israeli-Palestinian relations still being defined by a conflict for 100 years to come, which I think is a great shame.
Any more questions, reflections, answers? So we're gonna finish. Maybe just one last question, and maybe someone else will step up. But talking about the criticism towards Israel now, you understand, and I think most of the people now here, it's in many cases it's done about how the world and how the war looks like, about the civilian death, death of children, destruction of the houses. So it's this wave of anti-Semitism that we see everywhere in social media. It's a direct, of course, reaction to the war, to these sites, to the, and I think when you watch Israeli news, and I watch all the time Israeli news, I know that as an Israeli viewer, you are kind of a bit protected from these sites. The second you switch to CNN or to anything else, pretty much, you see the absolute humanitarian disaster in Gaza. So what would be your answer to, I don't know, what would be that direct, I think the way how you could criticize Israeli approach, Israeli policy, strategies, how the Hamas is eliminated in Gaza. And so what would be the right answer? I'm asking it because I'm torn. I see the devastation. I see the humanitarian catastrophe, and on the other side I understand that Israel has a right to protect itself, but how can you discuss it? How can you approach it? I don't know. It's 21st century and we are seeing the brutal sides of the First World War pretty much.
So I'm not sure I understood the question.
My question is where is that borderline? Like, one of the themes of our discussion is like, where lies this difference? And if you're going to tell me that's because the people should believe that Israel should exist, that's too simple of an answer. We had hundreds and hundreds of Latvian intellectuals, progressives, left-wing artists, whatever, signing a letter where they literally sign their names under that it's occupation, apartheid, and Israel should leave West Bank and this and that, and genocide, yeah. And I don't think all these people are anti-Semitic, and according to the lecture, they are. So I don't know, what would be your answer to all that?
Well, my answer would be simple. First, ask these people, do they accept the right of the State of Israel to exist as the national home of the Jewish people in accordance with the United Nations Partition Plan and Resolution of November 29, 1947? If they say yes, okay. But try this with BDS people, and you'll see how difficult it is for them to just say the simple yes. Do you accept the right of the Jewish people to a state, to a national home, to a state in the land of Israel, in Palestine? Yes or no? I mean, how difficult it is. Ask those intellectuals who signed the letter. Ask those students at Harvard. I mean, it's a very simple question, and somehow people tend to very much complicate it. So it makes you wonder, is there a reason why they complicate the answer? Because it's clear cut. Either you say yes or you say no. Now, to the broader point of view, look, the humanitarian disaster in Gaza is real. It exists, whether you are pro-Israeli, anti-Israeli. When babies die, they die. They're babies. They're innocent. the question to ask is, who's responsible for that happening? I mean, why does the international community not state in a very clear way that Hamas is responsible for the human tragedy there? That would make a difference. But I'm not hearing that strongly enough. I'm not hearing people saying just this very plain and simple thing. Hamas started the war, and then it has been using a civilian population as human shields, deliberately. So, in a sense, the tragedy for which Hamas is responsible is twofold. It is responsible for the death, for the murder of more than 1,200 Israelis, and it is responsible for the death of over 10,000 Palestinians. Why is this simple, plain truth not being stated as such? Was Britain responsible in the sense of, I mean, sorry that I'm using this cliche again, but it is the right analogy. Was Britain to blame for the death of 2-year-old babies in Dresden? They were babies. They were innocent as British babies. But will you hold that it was Britain's fault, that it was to blame for doing that? This constant, and sorry to say, constant European tendency to sort of balance things, to use analogies, because there is always one side and the other side. Sometimes this is the case, sometimes this is not the case. Look, in Russia, there were babies who died, Russian babies. Just like there were Ukrainian babies who died. Is it the Ukrainian fault that they died? Did they start the war? Are they the aggressors? Are they the ones who continue in the war and are the reason why it doesn't stop? Obviously not. So this equation, they kill 1,000, you are killing, no, they kill 1,000 and then they're responsible for the killing of 10,000. That is the sad truth. Why is it so difficult to say it as it is?
Yes, I have answered to two things you kind of raised these questions about. The one is, do Israelis have right to live in their homeland? And then it's, I think it's a more complicated yes and no answer. One is a yes, and then people will start fighting about borders. Green line, not green line, where, settlers, not settlers. But
Wait,
the question...
I was very specific. I said,
yes.
Does Israel have a right to exist in its internationally recognized, UN recognized borders?
Great.
This is not complicated. This is yes or no.
And another thing, I think the problem was why all the, I don't know, the guilt and the blame lays with IDF or with Israeli government about what's happening in Gaza as a problem. It's because the world is like looking, I know that many people around me are looking like, you can reason with Hamas, you can reason, they're terrorists, they're, Islamic Jihad, whatever. The only people you can reason with and call them for whatever, behave yourselves, or stop it, is Israel, because it's a government, it's internationally acknowledged, the state. I think that might be also a problem that, from Israeli side, when you're saying that Hamas is responsible for all of it, it doesn't work, even though you believe it.
Isn't that a bit patronizing? Oh, these Arabs, they're like children. No, I don't see it this way. They are grown-ups, we are grown-ups, and they are grown-ups who turn criminals. It's not the same thing. I mean, it's not. You cannot really say, oh, well, I mean, you can, but I don't see the point saying, well, Hamas, they're like so childish, they're so brutal. You cannot really, you can't really make sense of their actions. You have to be tolerant to the way they behave because they are what? Because they are what? Because they are Arabs? That's like almost racist, but for sure is patronizing. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, one last question then, and then we'll let you go to the next lecture.
I'm sorry,
Well, there
I'm
will
still
be
not.
totally different questions.
I'm still not getting it a little bit. So, is there any legitimate criticism of Israel in this context?
In the context of the current conflict?
Yes.
Okay. First, I want to distinguish between two things. It may be someone's opinion that the strategies applied by Israel are not smart or not efficient or anything. That is not anti-Semitism. Again, for me, as long as you recognize the right of Israel to the right of the Jewish people to a state, or you don't draw a distinction between the Jewish people and other peoples, then you're not an anti-Semite, whichever it is that you say. So the obvious answer is yes. You can criticize Israel without it being labeled as anti-Semitism. Look, I think Israel has been way too soft in the way it's been handling the situation since the first day of the atrocities. That's also criticizing the government, only from a different direction. So obviously that's not anti-Semitism. Now, we should be very careful with the way we use this term, and that's why I provided the narrowest definition possible. I remind you, I didn't even say if you deny the right of Israel to exist, you're an anti-Semite. I said if you deny the right of Israel to exist, but you accept the right of the United States to exist, then I want you to reflect as to why this is the case. And if the case is, you say, English Protestants are allowed to be colonialists, but European Jews are not allowed, then you are becoming an anti-Semite.
Okay, we have
Just crossed that line and became an anti-Semite.
Okay, we have a few minutes left, but there's a question also from a YouTube channel. Why doesn't Israel want to stop its settler policy and the occupation and allow Palestinians to have their own state as in pre-1967 borders?
Why doesn't Israel want to do that?
Yeah, why doesn't Israel want to stop its settler policy and end the occupation?
Well, ironically, as you all recall, Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip in its entirety. And the result was. So the question is not so much what Israel wants to do, but what is possible for Israel to do. What would be the result of a full Israeli withdrawal from all the territories taken over in 1967? Well, if Gaza is any guide, maybe that question should be somewhat critically approached.
Okay, last question.
I think we all can agree on that currently the Palestinian side isn't able to be recognized as being able of making peace with Israel. Do you think the Israeli government at the current state with Benjamin Netanyahu and many very pro-settlement ministers or officials is able to make peace with Palestine?
With a hypothetical Palestine or with a real one?
With a hypothetical Palestine.
With a hypothetical, the answer would be no. But because it's a hypothetical, because it's a hypothetical, it does not come to, which is why I say again, I think the best thing that can come out of this conflict, if anything good can come out of it, is for Hamas to be eradicated, and then the international community, not just you, the international community, the European Union, would have a much better case in demanding Israel to change certain policies. Right now, that case doesn't exist.
Okay, so thank you so much. Thank you, Uriya. We have a last few words from the museum, because as during your lecture, as people who came here saw that we are creating a mural of the Jewish rescue story next to just across from Janis Lipke house, and Maya will tell a few words what it means and so what's the connection. But first, applause to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have to stand in the right spot. So yeah, you will see mural dedicated to two brothers, two sons of Sarah Ichlova. She was from Daugavpils, and she already had her first son, Misha. And then the war started, and the Holocaust started. And she managed to smuggle the oldest son out of the ghetto and give it to a lady named Tekla Baluede. And then, ironically, she fell in love and had another child. Imagine. Sometimes people are confused, how can it happen? But from the memoirs of Holocaust survivors, I know that the taste for life, wish to live at least one more day, one more hour, it's present in them. So she fell in love and had another child, Grisha. And I don't know how, I don't know the whole details, but they survived. She survived long enough to give a child to an orphanage, and then she died. And these two brothers were adopted by different relatives, by the men's relatives, and they were separated. And when they meet again, brothers, in the 80s, they had to have a translator, interpreter, because yes, they were blood, they were brothers, but they grew up in different parts of the world, and they couldn't understand each other. And it came quite late in their lives when they actually learned about how they grew up, what's their story, and what's the story of Sarah and this courageous, courageous mom. And one thing that strikes me in today's world is that the Misha, the boy in hiding, he was for quite a long time afraid of light, and he just whispered. And you know these stories from today's world too.
Thank you. Paldies visiem. Paldies, kā atnācāt. Un tie, kas vēlās, var turpināt doties uz nākamo lekciju, kur profesors Šavits lasīs mazajā aulā. Okay, so thank you so much for coming. Thank you much for visiting Lipka Memorial, listening to the lecture that is kind of about tough subjects and very heated subjects at this point in the world. And those who want, I invite you for the next lecture that you are giving at Latvian University at Mazais Auls to ask more questions. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.